At the end of May 2023, NVIDIA launched their new ULMB 2 ultra-low motion blur technology and certification scheme. Best of all, this has been made available as a free update to two existing monitors, one from Acer and one from Asus. We've got with us now the Asus PG27AQN, and we're going to do some testing before and after the update, as well as test all of the other updates that NVIDIA said they included with the technology. Now, these screens didn't have ULMB at all before, so this is actually a free update to the existing screens, available as a simple and easy to install firmware update from the Asus monitor webpage. You just download it and it installs in around 5 to 10 minutes automatically, and once you do, you've got the option for ULMB 2 within the on-screen menu. NVIDIA tell us that they've also made a few tweaks to the response time performance, particularly in VRR situations. So before we update the firmware on our model, we're going to do some testing of the performance before, and then we'll compare it to the after performance once we've done that upgrade. First of all, we compared the 4 overdrive modes while running at a maximum 360Hz refresh rate. On the original firmware, you can see that even the off mode is very fast for an IPS panel, measured at 3.6 milliseconds gray to gray average and showing no overshoot at all. But it does struggle to keep up with the high 360Hz frame rate. There's a low 27% refresh rate compliance with overdrive turned off, although in practice the motion clarity is still pretty good, as most transitions are still pretty close to that refresh rate window. Switching up to the normal mode offers a nice improvement in response times, down to 2.2 milliseconds gray to gray, and with very good refresh rate compliance at 80% now. However, some low levels of overshoot are now measured, and in practice this is pretty reasonable, and only very faint halos are evident in some situations. The esports and extreme modes look and perform very similarly to one another. They don't really offer any meaningful improvements in gray to gray response times compared with the normal mode, and the overshoot is a bit more noticeable, although still only what we'd call moderate at this refresh rate. Some halos are visible in some situations though. We settled with the normal overdrive mode for the best balance and measured performance now across the variable refresh rate range, with G-Sync enabled from the maximum 360Hz all the way down to 60Hz. The G-Sync module should provide variable overdrive, which should reduce the overdrive impulse as the refresh rate lowers, resulting in slightly slower response times, but helping to reduce or avoid overshoot. At 240Hz in VRR, the variable overdrive didn't seem to be doing much on the original firmware, and overshoot was starting to creep up, although still reasonable in practice. For lower refresh rates though, the response times were slowed a bit, but the overshoot was becoming more visible in practice, and at what we would call moderate levels. You could see some dark trails, especially at the lower refresh rates like 60Hz, quite easily, and had this been the end of it, we'd have probably determined that the overdrive control could have definitely done with some tweaking. Thankfully, NVIDIA have done some tweaks to the overdrive as part of the new ULMB 2 update. They've actually done two things here. Firstly, they've switched their testing approach to use a response time measurement that is closer to what we use at TFT Central, and what we call gamma-corrected response times. This means that when they're making adjustments and tuning their overdrive performance from the G-Sync module, it should offer more accurate results that are more in tune with what you would see visually. Secondly, they've then used this to adjust the variable overdrive performance, they say, across the VRR range. We updated the firmware and tested the response times again. At the fixed 360Hz maximum refresh rate, you can see significant improvements now in performance on all settings. The normal mode now delivered excellent overshoot performance, with basically none detected at all, and even those higher esports and extreme modes offered what we'd rate as good performance here for overshoot, although actually there was no real benefit in terms of response times compared with the normal mode. This is, however, some nice tweaking overall from NVIDIA. We stuck with the normal mode and tested VRR performance as well. The overshoot had been cut down significantly now, and at no point across the VRR range did it become visible in practice or problematic. The variable overdrive was working better now to control the overshoot, and so even at the lower end of the refresh rate, we didn't see any overshoot issues at all now in practice. This was a really positive change, we thought, and bravo to NVIDIA for adjusting things and making free improvements for the owners of this screen. We then moved on to testing ULMB 2, and to be honest, we were super impressed. The ULMB 2 option appears in the on-screen display menu once you've updated the firmware, and it's a simple on-off control. You do need to first disable G-Sync from the NVIDIA control panel for this to be usable, but once you have, it's available at several fixed refresh rates, including 144, 240 and 360 Hz. It's not available to use at the same time as VRR, so you will have to stick to a fixed refresh rate to use it, like nearly all blur reduction modes. NVIDIA have investigated support for ULMB and VRR at the same time, but they tell us that it doesn't really yet meet their high expectations when it comes to performance quality, and it's particularly complicated to make work as well. You will see there's also a ULMB2 pulse width setting available, which lets you control the length of the strobe. As you turn that setting down, it will offer some minor improvements to motion clarity, but it is at the cost of brightness. But still, this is probably the optimal way to adjust the screen brightness if you did want to lower it and make it a little bit darker for your games. So you can use that setting rather than using the normal brightness control. ULMB2 is a new tier of performance for motion blur reduction backlights, and NVIDIA have set a range of criteria that a screen must meet to be able to pass this certification. So firstly, the screen is going to have to feature NVIDIA's native G-Sync module. That's the chip inside the screen. Any screen without the module is not going to be able to qualify or receive ULMB2 as an update. Secondly, NVIDIA say that the screen, while running ULMB2 mode, must have the equivalent motion clarity of a display that is a theoretical 1000 Hz display. Now, to keep this simple, NVIDIA have calculated this by taking basically 4 times the refresh rate of the screen with ULMB2 active. That is the equivalent calculation for their motion clarity. So an example 360 Hz screen would reach a hypothetical 1440 Hz motion clarity. What it does mean is that for a screen to qualify, it's going to need to have at least a 250 Hz refresh rate. That means the wide variety of 240 Hz and below refresh rate screens are not going to qualify for this certification. To calculate this equation, NVIDIA set up a very high-end and expensive custom pursuit camera system with a high-speed camera and a panning robotic arm. They were able to compare a 480 Hz refresh rate monitor with a 120 Hz refresh rate screen that had ULMB enabled, and found that they had pretty similar effective motion clarity in practice. In fact, if you look at the comparisons here, the ULMB panel may even look a little bit clearer, but it's pretty comparable at the end of the day, and so this is what led to that 4 times refresh rate approximation. So to qualify for the ULMB2 certification, the effective refresh rate of the screen needs to be at least 1000 Hz. Secondly, the brightness needs to be able to reach at least 250 nits, which is quite rare for a strobing blur reduction backlight. We measured 270 nits on the Asus screen with the pulse width set to a default maximum 100 level and brightness also at 100. It can reach down to as low as 24 nits if you need to, simply by lowering the pulse width setting. With a high brightness, even in blur reduction mode, you get great flexibility to meet different gaming situations and room lighting conditions. Thirdly, NVIDIA say that the screen is going to need to be able to run the motion blur reduction mode at its maximum refresh rate, at the screen's maximum refresh rate. That might sound like an obvious thing, but actually if you look back at some of the current and original 360 Hz screens, any blur reduction mode is not always available at the maximum refresh rate. As an example, the first 360 Hz monitor that we tested, and one of the first to markets, was the Asus PG27AQN. That had a 360 Hz screen, 24.5 inch in size, but actually the ULMB mode on that screen was only available up to 240 Hz max. Lastly, NVIDIA say that the screen is going to have to offer minimal strobe crosstalk. Now, what constitutes minimal is not really described or explained, but NVIDIA do have a technology called vertical dependent overdrive that will help make sure that the strobe crosstalk is at a minimal level on these screens. Crosstalk is where you see ghosting and trailing behind moving objects when using strobing blur reduction modes. It's caused by various things, but one of the most significant is panel response times. On some screens, the panel response times are simply not fast enough to keep up with the strobing properly, and you get loads of ghost images and trailing when you use them. We've seen quite a few monitors over the years actually that offer really poor strobing modes, and it makes them basically unusable. On other screens, if there's visible overshoot, this can also lead to additional trails and halos when you use those blur reduction modes, which again is distracting. On a screen with a decent and usable blur reduction mode, typically you'll see one region of the screen that is clearer than the other parts. Now hopefully this will be the middle part of the screen where most of your attention is focused during gaming and usage, but it's not always. And what it does mean is that the other parts, maybe the top or the bottom region, are less clear. Even very highly regarded gaming screens like the BenQ Zowie ZX2566K with its 360Hz TN film panel shows some trailing in places when using its blur reduction mode. For the ULMB2 monitors like the Asus screen that we have here, the G-Sync module makes available a special feature called vertical dependent overdrive. In simple terms, this allows NVIDIA to define the overdrive levels for different areas of the screen so that performance can be maximised, whether it's in the top, middle or bottom region of the screen. So each part of the screen can be adjusted independently rather than the whole panel at the same time. We tested ULMB2 in a range of motion tests and we were really impressed by the results. 360Hz operation without ULMB2 was already very clear and offered really good motion clarity, but when you enable ULMB2, you get another bump in motion clarity. It makes tracking of moving objects across the screen, panning shots, tracking of moving text and finer details much clearer. And the vertical dependent overdrive seemed to be doing a really good job here as well of making a much larger portion of the screen clearer than you might otherwise expect. So you had a big area of the screen that was free from strobe crosstalk, trailing and that kind of thing. This pursuit camera video provided by NVIDIA captures the real-world perceived motion clarity of the screen with ULMB turned off and on, and you can see the difference. We found the same kind of benefits in practice as well with familiar tests like those on blurbusters.com. NVIDIA have done a really good job with ULMB2, and it's great to see this available as a free upgrade to 2 existing screens. NVIDIA have already confirmed 2 other screens will feature ULMB2 at launch, and more are expected to follow. Remember that to qualify for ULMB2, the monitor will have to meet the criteria we've just talked about, so we expect this to be a fairly exclusive club in the early days. Hopefully that's given you a nice overview of ULMB2 and the changes that NVIDIA have made with the new update. If you've got any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below. If you've got the screen, let us know how you found the update and if you're enjoying ULMB2 as well. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on future videos and content, and leave us a like if you've enjoyed this as well. We'll see you next time.